Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Scarborough Southwest.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I also want to thank my colleague for his fantastic rant. Now, this weekend, I was at an event at Warden Woods Community Centre called Peace for Scarborough, because in Scarborough we have many impoverished neighbourhoods with few economic opportunities, Mr. Speaker. I was there and, of course, talking to a group of young people. I asked them about employment, and two of them shot up their hands saying they had part-time jobs. And then when I asked who wants to have a job, then all their hands shot up, Mr. Speaker. There's clearly a lack of opportunity for young people. And today a report came out showing that in Ontario, the low-wage workforce has skyrocketed by 94% over the past 2 decades, Mr. Speaker, and that Ontario's workforce has gone from having 3% of the workers making minimum wage to over 12%, Mr. Speaker. And this really demonstrates that over the last 2 decades, successive Liberal and Conservative governments have done a terrible job on improving the living conditions of people in Ontario living in poverty, Mr. Speaker, particularly young people who need opportunities. I'd like to ask the member if he has some ideas of perhaps what should be in this budget implementation bill to actually help young Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Skanderborg Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, here are the facts. The Conservatives have to talk about, we heard it just this morning, about how they've weathered through, the Canadian economy has weathered through the last recession. Well, that's not true for the economy writ large, but it's particularly not true for young Canadians and young workers. There are 250,000 fewer jobs for young Canadians right now than there were before the recession. That's according to Finance Canada. There's an important provision in this, and we've also seen job quality, as my friend talks about, dropping dramatically across the entire economy, but particularly for young people. Fewer and fewer of those entrance jobs, and we know, Mr. Speaker, through all the evidence that young people, when they go and get the training at colleges and polytechnic and universities, that if they don't get into their field of employment soon after that training, it's called employment scarring, that the effects and the impacts on their earning over their entire working lives is dramatically lessened. They've got to get into the work that they need. We've seen this in this bill. This is an important piece I didn't mention before. Unpaid internships. Right now, under the Canadian Labour Code, those unpaid interns, those young people looking to get the experience they need, are not protected under the Labour Code against sexual harassment or unfair work conditions. You'd think the Conservatives would move that into the Labour Code so that these young people in particular doing these internships would be protected. Well, they said they would, and then when we got to the bill, they didn't. And so the Canadian Students Associations, the Canadian Intern Association, all of them came forward at committee and said, what are you doing? Why would any Canadian business taking an intern also not want to commit to protecting them against sexual harassment? And the Conservatives said, don't worry about it, we'll take care of that later, after having promised to do it here. Here was something practical that could be done to protect young Canadian workers entering the workforce. The Conservatives simply made a choice, and the choice was not to take action to protect some of the most vulnerable workers, those that are seeking internships, particularly unpaid ones, to try to get the experience because the job market is so lousy for them, they got to go do these other means to get the experience that they so desperately desire. So for the love of Pete, we moved the amendments. We implored the Conservatives to do this, make this change, protect young Canadian workers from unfair work conditions, from extended hours, from sexual harassment. And the Conservatives, the tough-on-crime Conservatives, said no, over and over again. It's shameful. I have no idea, Mr. Speaker, in all good reason and ethic and morality why the Conservatives wouldn't act on this, but they didn't. New Democrats obviously will. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming